See that? Okay, I'm going to pick up from where I left off last night. I might review the last 5 slides from last night to get you back in. And I think we were going to subdue the lights. So let me get this. Oh, yes, we have to do this now. This by hand. I cleaned it up a little bit. And I didn't have Hebrew fonts at the time. It was 20 years ago. But for this conference, I tried to make it a little bit more readable. Tried to remove the details and take you through it in sequence. So here we are, the end of the first month of this. Rabbinical tradition says the whole sequence of the plates happened over 2.5 months in the early spring just before the equinox. And that's where I scaled the orbit, and it works out. It really does. This is to scale day by day. This is not just a conceptual diagram. We'll get to that. I mean, I took it to scale, graphed it, and then traced that to make this, and we'll get to the other. So now we have the Earth is in a horizontal circle, and the path of the Venus you see is beneath our plane, but coming back up now. We're on the way up. That means we're getting closer and closer to this main tail of debris. So we got the cattle disease. Now we got the shkin, the boils. Dever is cattle. It means they die bad. But dever in Hebrew also means a discussion. Neseret hadeburim, the 10 discussions. It's not commandments in Hebrew. It's kind of like a mistranslation there. But a debor, devar, dvora is a honeybee, so the name Deborah there. But it also means a meteor. So all of these things kind of tie together there with the cattle disease, if you want to think about that. We go to Shkin, and we have the boils, but I'm saying the stuff falling from the sky was stuff from the volcano and stuff from Venus, and Venus was close enough to set off the volcano. When you have a confluence of causes that are going to contribute to an effect, it's doubly the effect happened. So that's the kind of thing that I'm seeing throughout this. Let's go to the next. The hailfire. We've got that. Now what happens? This is where it gets very interesting. I said Venus is coming up from beneath. Now we got locusts everywhere. The gregarious form is seen on one side, and the one that swarms. There's ordinary locusts. They tend to be camouflaged, and they kind of keep to themselves. But when they get a certain thing comes over them, they flash yellow and they swarm. It's like a mob rather than a group of people. And so what I'm looking at is on an oblique trajectory. Venus is coming up underneath us now from the south, and it's partially eclipsing our planet like that. Why do I say that? Because what happens next can only be explained this way. There's no meteorological way to explain this. Moses says, you're going to have locusts. And for all the rest of that day and into the night, a super strong, sustained gale, hurricane-type wind blew the locusts in. The locusts usually were in the grassland in Libya. It was grassland at the time before the climate change. Now they're being blown into Egypt all of a sudden and swarming everything. So what you have here, Kol hayom hahu v'kol halayla. All the day, that one, and the night. Haboker haya, the morning was, v'ruach hakadim, the east wind, nasa et harbe, it brought the locusts. That's phenomenal. You don't have a freak wind blowing super strong like that all day and into the night, and then locusts. But we did this time. So I'm looking at the eclipse of the planet there, shading the large area. The temperature drops like 25 degrees just in the small area of totality that we'll see tomorrow. So imagine a semi-continental size area cooled. That will bring a thermal breeze. The breeze is going to cool down. The cool air's got to go somewhere, and it's going to go into the warm. The warm air is going to rise, and there's electrical effects that enhance the sweep over at the upper altitudes. You got locusts. They're bad. They're everywhere. Your harvest is gone. Only what hasn't come out of the ground yet is not going to be affected. They eat the trees. They eat everything. Not a green thing survives, and they leave their feces everywhere. Moses says, when do you want these locusts gone? Tomorrow. By this time tomorrow, not a single one shall remain. Wind started kicking up. Hurricane wind again. All into the night. From the reverse direction. Meteorology can't do that. But this did, I'm saying. It's spooky. Because What gets my attention is immediately after this, which I can only attribute to partial eclipse of the planet, we get the darkness. The whole planet is eclipsed for 3 days of partial darkness, 3 days of total darkness, 3 days of partial darkness again. These reconciling the various accounts like that. So now you're starting to see what the locust led into now became complete with the darkness. But it was no ordinary darkness. Scripture says this darkness was so intense, of such an unearthly nature, that you could feel it. If you're standing right, you couldn't see your hand in front of your own face. And I'm saying that was an electric dust storm on the whole planet. When our plasma tail on Earth hits Mars, the whole planet has a plasma dust storm. You can't see any features until that dust storm subsides. And there's no atmosphere to speak of. It's an electric storm. So I'm saying we experienced that. DZ Parker, you've experienced some of these effects. You can testify. Anyone else here been through a haboob or a dust storm? They happen here in Arizona with the monsoons. So the next time you see that, or when you see the eclipse tomorrow, think of these kinds of things intensified on a planetary scale now instead of just our moon. Choshek. Here's the orbital diagram to scale that we've been talking about. There's our months, and there you go. And you can count day by day. We've got the plague of darkness days. Then we were told to tether the lamb on the 10th, and then the earthquake, the Passover on the 14th or the 13th for the rest of the world. 50 days later after the Passover, we count the Sinai event. So look, the orbit must have changed by then. It's a transition to the next orbital scenario of Velikovsky. So, darkness. It gets dark. You have an eclipse. But you could still see the stars. No, even the stars went out. It got so bad, the candles went out. You couldn't see the face of your neighbor. This is how it is. Headlights are stronger than any candle or torch. And look what happens. For 3 days and nights of total darkness like this, and 3 days on the front and back with partial darkness like that, unforgettable. When the account says Pharaoh hardened his heart, or somebody hardened his heart and all that, it's a figure of speech. Kaved. In Hebrew, kaved means heavy. And in the Egyptian, every decision you make over your whole life, you get weighed in the judgment here. And if the decision of your heart isn't as light as the feather of truth and correctness and rightness, then this hippopotamus, lion, mangled beast with a crocodile's mouth says you lose. So, now we've had all these plagues up to the darkness. And this looks spooky, you know. All the firstborn would die. Has there ever been something like that in the history of the world? Velikovsky highlights that there was earthquake and all the houses fell. He says the Bekor were the select. Yes, they were. I agree with his arguments as far as he goes. But he didn't know this. We found this in epidemiology just 20 years ago, and Velikovsky couldn't have known that. So I want to take this glyph that's been iconic in Electric Universe videos, and I wanted to add the technical knowledge that we have now and open our eyes to that. And then see how spooky the people must have felt and convey the whole human experience. Jewish tradition says the firstborn died at midnight. It was spooky. From the firstborn of the men in the palace, workers in the factories, and even all the animals. And at that same time, the temples fell, the idols and statues fell over and were destroyed. It was a spooky, spooky, unforgettable thing in the middle of the night. So I say, on that eclipse, that trajectory, it eclipsed us. We got the spooky wind, but now it keeps coming on that same trajectory and gets even closer. And we have a planetary earthquake. The whole planet goes off. And for us, it was the middle of the night. So, think of the totality of the circumstances, given that all the plagues have happened just so far. Not just in Egypt, but globally. All the stories corroborate. around the world differently given the different positions around the world. For Egypt, Egypt's famine protocol was that the firstborn should be given a double portion in times of famine, from the palace to the workers to the animals. The locusts had destroyed everything. The ground was moist because of the fire. Its chemistry was modified because of the petroleum. So that gives rise to different bacteria to dominate that don't normally. You couldn't have anything green to eat, so you had to go for grain, whatever grain you could get. These were buried in shallow pits in the ground to keep them safe, but before they could eat that grain, the darkness hit. 3 days, 9 days of just darkness and sandstorm. They went back out to get their food buried under this sand, moist sand, contaminated with locust feces, and even that was with a ground that was modified. So these are the conditions for a mold called Stachybotrys. And this is bad. It causes pulmonary edema, and you fill with fluid, and it's the same thing that killed the horses in the other thing, only the human form. This forms as a layer on top. If you remove that top layer, the rest of it would be bad, but not deadly. So from the very most deadly layer, the firstborn all got a double dose. If eating this was bad enough to kill you half to death, a double dose is what the firstborn got. So we have contaminated grain, death by Stachybotrys of firstborn of men and beasts from the palace down to the workers, and the idols, the emblems of Egypt's control, fell. We'll talk more about lightning. We'll talk more about lightning. Why don't we hear lightning striking the temples and all that? Because Egypt, of all the inhabited landmass of Earth, is tellurically insulated from lightning strikes. Do you see that? So when the planet was getting sculpted and the Grand Canyon was being carved and all the things we saw today, on the day side, it was midnight for us and we were insulated. Very, very spooky thing that I can't forget now that I've seen it. So look at Egypt. Here we go from the Nile east to that wall of the canal there. But all that was Egypt. We crossed the peninsula and crossed over there. You can march it in 7 days. Moshe Dayan did it in the last war. Velikovsky looks at this, his friend Claude Schaeffer, who wrote in French, and said if we compare this stratigraphy of the ancient Near East, the one thing stands out. We've got intercontinental earthquakes leveling every city of the Middle Bronze. So bad as to shock the quartz. If your stairways are made of quartz and the earthquakes come, the quartz itself gets shocked. That's a mineral thing you can test. We don't have earthquakes like that today. 50 years later, there was another intercontinental decimating earthquake. So there you go. So to align the stratigraphy of the ancient world, you take these two mega earthquakes and the evidence of it, because all the cities burned after an earthquake like that, and you align them. If your chronology hypothesis didn't have them aligned before. Aligning them this way, we've been studying the chronology, is consistent with what Velikovsky's chronology is. As he filled in the details and confabulated, even his confabulations, people quibble and argue, but they're the same layer, the same strata. The chronology holds. Earthquakes, global earthquakes. Now, Passover. You know, you have the blood on the door and the lamb sandwich that night and all that, you know, the good food, but you don't have time to cook the bread, so you eat it flat, right? We ate at an Indian restaurant last night. You have that flat cracker bread shaped round and the lamb, and so I ate that, and it kind of, yeah, if you got to get out in a hurry and go on a long trip fast, you want massive protein, vegetables, and you don't want yeast. Besides, you got to carry all the bread you got, and you can't cook it in the desert. You cook it flat, stack it, and you can pack it on your back. So we were told to eat it like that. But I can't help thinking that Venus aspect must have presented something like this. It was seen as a door in the sky. Or a lady with long hair, I don't know, it's around the world, you see. And 3 days later, it looks like that. So Venus must have crossed from one side of the sun to the other at sunset. See? So, but then it would have set with the sun, and it would have been an ordinary full moon night for anyone new. There are questions we ask at Passover as children. Why is tonight different from all other nights? Well, I think tonight you're going to have some answers that have more insight than we've had for some 3,600 years. Earthquake, yes. Stone doors, yes. But we lived in mud huts made of straw and expedient materials. This is a model of the houses we had. Actual archaeology. So, I can't help the notion that we were told don't boil it in water. It's got to be roasted lamb. Put it to the door for the 10th and keep it there until the 14th. At the evening of the 14th, before the sun goes down, you roast this lamb. So there's the fire of roasting. There's the lamb, and it's a good meal, of course. But we were told to put red spray paint on the door. The blood of the lamb is red. You take a sprinkling plant like baby's breath or something. You dip and you spray. You dip and you spray on the mashkof and on the mezuzot, the lintel and the two doorposts. So we've got this red emblem echoing what was seen in the sky on our houses. We're told to stay in the house, don't go outside the house all night. So I can't help but thinking that Venus had something to do with this. And this sign that endures to our day, the blood over the door, is a visual glyph and a calendar date that preserves data. So this whole sequence of events preserves data that's consistent with this orbit and consistent with the latest in electric universe that we just found out this week, or at least I did. So here we go. It happened at midnight in Egypt. Firstborn die. Pharaoh has to deal with that. And everyone else going through the same thing. And the earthquake. That morning, he let us go. So I think it took all of that to get to that point. So, food for thought. To understand the rest of this, we're going to need to basically review astrodynamics, n-body dynamics, and some things like that. So if anyone wants to stretch their legs for a minute, get a drink of water, and all that, we're going to have a short remedial review. So I'm going to keep these slides going, and that's what it is. The dark magic liquid that restores life. So sure, I'll take a break. Okay, so we're going to review the astronaut's paradox, the n-body paradox, and the electric paradox. So this is your astrodynamics crasher course. If you're an astronaut in low Earth orbit and you want to catch up to your buddy, I'm not talking about buzzing around the space station. I'm talking about he's 2 miles ahead on the same orbit. How do you get there? Do you fire your thruster? Well, that'll make you go faster and you'll go into a higher orbit. In the higher orbit, you're traveling faster, but the distance around a larger circle is so much that you'll actually lag behind. So that's not the way to get to your buddy. Let's try it again.
Slow down and you're lower.
You're a good astronaut. That's what we do, exactly. So we slow down. That drops us to a lower orbit, and so now we catch up. Then we speed up, rise to the previous orbit, and hey, we rendezvous. Astronautics 101. Now let's take it to the n-body paradox. Two bodies that aren't big enough to really affect each other gravitationally can orbit in the same orbit, just like you and your astronaut buddy in the previous example. So, but what if you get big? So big that you actually do feel the gravity from each other. Well, what's going to happen? We're going to speed up and rise to a higher orbit, slow down and fall to a higher orbit. It's not going to work. Trying to pull us together from the same orbit is going to split us apart because of the orbital paradox. It's not a paradox. This is the way it works. Electrically, the forces are reversed. So now, if two bodies of the same charge are so large that they repel each other electrically, well, we're going to fall to the lower, rise to the higher, and it's going to bring us right back around. So we've got, if it's gravity, we're going to try to go together and diverge. If we try to push each other apart with the electric, it's going to bring us back around. So this whole interplay of this whole thing is going to have a give and take. Charges are going to go back and forth, and all these dynamics are going to be interplaying. So even with the locust, you have an eclipse here and then something, and then an eclipse on the other side, and the movement. And so this kind of give and take, but moving gently forward, interplay of these kind of forces is what it takes to understand how I see this happening. No, we have the electric, we have the universe sandbox, but it's gravity only. We need an electric sandbox for the astronomy and also for what we're doing with the geosculpting, the geophysics. So now let's look at tidal dynamics. We've got the tide, we've got the core, we've got the mantle, we've got the continents, we've got the ocean, but the atmosphere itself is also affected by tides. So what kind of tides are we talking about? Normal tides we have. Tide goes up and down some 3 feet, and the ocean, the ground itself moves up that much, but the ocean moves that much more, and so we have tides. Tides are a higher power than the square, so I think it's third or fourth cubed. We'll have to look that up and be sure to lock that down. But being conservative, let's go with cubed. Do you okay? Well, you got to catch this. Can I have like a minute or two? So, but if you're landlocked, you won't get that tide. We were landlocked here on the seismically active region, and tidal wind happens there. So, back from the coffee break, let's run through the rest of this and be done. Pillar of fire, not an earthly thing, but it looked kind of like that. Doré got it right, it's in the sky. But it's not a volcano, it's not a pillar of fire in the same place. It's a comet wheeling around in the sky because the scripture says this thing was a pillar of smoke in the day to guide our way, but it lit our way at night, and you can't do that by shining a fire in somebody's face. It's got to be behind you. So it's wheeling around in the northern sky. That means Venus is above the northern hemisphere. Want to clear up another misconception from Cecil B. DeMille? It wasn't a narrow single file way. We got an army and we got to run. I ain't going in there. We got the army. I ain't going there. No, not that. The army's coming, and their weapons float, but they're coming now. So I think our director, Ridley Scott, got it right. This bridge is 12 miles across and 12 miles wide, but it's a mile deep there and just as deep to the north. Seismic activity or something, tidal waves are low and fast in deep water, but they slow down and stand up. Same from the other. So we got this land bridge. They're going to converge, and they're not going to disappear. They're going to whoosh. So you got all that. You can start to see it. Tsunami. Let's look at this. We have an earthquake or some kind of disturbance. The wave comes, not much in the deep water, but as it comes close to our land bridge here, it slows down and stands up a wall of water. And the velocity would be like 30 miles an hour. We got 6 miles on either side, 30 miles an hour. As these comes together, you got 5 minutes of walls of water converging here. Okay? Ridley Scott got it right. So, now, Velikovsky says, when the lightning struck, the waves came together. D.Z. Parker shows we have electrostatic stuff, and his work tonight was the key. This is actual lightning strike causing that. Velikovsky was totally right, and I couldn't have known. The weapons floated. There you get to Sinai, Ark of the Covenant, all that. That's closest. So that Ivory from 800 BC remembers. We've gone through end-body dynamics, the cometary encounter. We've got this spiral encounter. And only because of the inside of electric universe have all the mysteries and keys that I couldn't solve before been answered. The moon is a comet tail with ions we didn't know. Interesting. The Aztec story is very interesting. All the stories of the world are very interesting because they corroborate. That's Velikovsky, the electric comet of Venus. Thank you. Something to think about.